She gave away her last meal to a stranger she would never see again. Or at least that is what she thought, because the quiet man sitting across from her that night owned every table in the room and was about to change her life in ways she could not imagine. The diner smelled like grease and salt, and something faintly sweet from the milkshakes spinning behind the counter. Sophie Miller stood by the register counting the few crumpled bills in her apron pocket, barely enough to cover her rent. That was already 3 days late. Her stomach tightened with hunger, but she ignored it the way she had learned to ignore so many things lately. When she turned, she noticed him, a man sitting alone in the far corner booth. His clothes were simple, nothing remarkable, but his posture was still and contained, like he did not belong to the noise around him. There was a tray in front of him with nothing but a cup of water, untouched, and something about the way his fingers rested on the table, quiet, patient, almost invisible, made her pause. Sophie hesitated, then glanced down at the small paper basket of fries she had just bought with her last few dollars. Golden, warm, the only thing she would eat tonight. She walked over before she could change her mind, setting half of the fries in front of him without asking. Her voice soft but steady. "You look like you could use these more than I do." The man looked up, surprised, his eyes darker than she expected, searching her face like he was trying to understand something deeper than the moment itself. For a second, neither of them spoke. The noise of the diner faded into the background, and then he gave a small nod. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice calm, almost careful. Sophie gave a quick shrug like it was nothing, even though her stomach twisted at the loss. "Just do not let them get cold," she replied, forcing a faint smile before stepping away, not knowing that the man she had just fed was watching her with a kind of attention no one had given her in a long time. Before continuing, comment where in the world you're watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Sophie returned to the counter, wiping her hands on her apron as the bell above the door chimed again. More customers, more orders, more noise, but her eyes drifted back to the corner booth. The man was eating slowly, thoughtfully, like each bite meant something. Not rushed, not careless. And when he finished, he did not leave right away. Instead, he sat there, observing the staff, the kitchen, the way the manager snapped at a new waitress, the way tips were collected and quietly pocketed. Sophie did not notice the shift in the air, but something had already begun to move, something quiet and powerful, because across the room, Adrian Cole, the hidden owner of the entire restaurant chain, had just found the one person he had been searching for without even knowing her name. And for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about profits or reports or expansion. He was thinking about a girl who had split her last meal without hesitation, and wondering what kind of world had made someone like her struggle to survive. The fries were gone, but the hunger stayed, and that was the part Sophie did not let herself think about as the night stretched longer and colder. The diner lights buzzing softly above her as she moved from table to table, her smile practiced, her voice steady. Even as her stomach tightened with every passing minute, she poured coffee, wiped counters, carried heavy plates that smelled richer than anything she could afford. And each time she passed the corner booth, she avoided looking directly at him, not because she regretted what she had done, but because some small part of her felt exposed, like it'd seen something too honest in her, something she usually kept hidden behind quick jokes and quiet endurance. Outside, the wind pressed against the glass windows, rattling them just enough to remind everyone inside how thin the barrier was between warmth and the cold world beyond. Sophie checked the clock above the kitchen door. 3 more hours until closing. 3 more hours until she could go home to a studio apartment barely big enough for a bed and a hot plate. She reached in her apron pocket again out of habit, her fingers brushing against nothing but lint and a folded receipt. No extra cash, no backup plan. Just another night survive at the same time across the room. Adrian Cole leaned back slightly in his seat, his gaze steady but unreadable. He had finished the fries minutes ago, but he remained, watching without being obvious, his mind moving quietly beneath the surface. He had come here tonight under a different purpose. Routine, inspection, numbers, patterns, a system he knew too well. But something had shifted the moment she placed that small paper basket in front of him. It was not the fries themselves, it was the decision behind them. The lack of hesitation after that first brief pause. The way she had chosen to give when she clearly had so little. Adrian had built his empire by studying behavior, by understanding what people did when no one was watching, and what he had just witnessed did not fit any pattern he trusted. He noticed the way the manager barked orders without looking at the staff, the way a young busboy moved too quickly, glancing over his shoulder as if afraid of being called out. He noticed a tip jar that seemed fuller earlier, now nearly empty. But he did not react. Not yet. Instead, his attention returned to Sophie, who was now at the counter trying to fix a mistake on an order ticket, while another server whispered something frustrated beside her. Sophie nodded, apologizing even when the error was not hers, her shoulders tense, but her tone calm. Adrian stood slowly, placing a few bills on the table, more than enough to cover what little he had ordered. And for a moment, he considered leaving without another word, letting the night remain exactly as it was, a quiet exchange between two strangers that would fade with time. But he did not move toward the door. Instead, he walked back to the counter, stopping just within her line of sight. Sophie looked up, surprised to see him there again, her eyes flickering with recognition and something else, something cautious. "You did not have to do that," she said softly, nodding toward the empty basket he had returned. Adrian gave a slight tilt of his head, his expression thoughtful. "I think I did," he replied, his voice just as calm as before. There was a brief silence, filled only by the hum of the refrigerator behind her and the distant clatter of dishes. Sophie hesitated, then gave a small shrug, trying to deflect the moment. "Well, next time you could just order your own," she said, attempting a light tone. Adrian almost smiled. "Almost next time," he repeated quietly, as if testing the words. And then he stepped back, turning toward the door at last. The bell chimed softly as he pushed it open, the cold night air rushing in for a second before the door closed again. Sophie watched him leave without meaning to, something unsettled and curious stirring beneath her exhaustion. She did not know why, but it felt like that small moment had not ended, like it had only just begun. And outside, standing on the sidewalk beneath the dim streetlight, Adrian paused, looking back at the diner through the glass, his reflection faint against the warm glow inside. For the first time in a long time, the numbers could wait, the reports could wait, because something far more important had just entered his world, and he was not about to ignore it. The next morning, before the city had fully woken up, Adrian Cole was already standing inside a glass-walled office on the top floor of a building that overlooked miles of quiet streets. The early lights stretching across polished floors and steel edges. Everything here was controlled, precise, efficient. Nothing like the small diner from the night before, and yet that was exactly where his mind kept returning. He stood with one hand in his pocket, the other holding a thin report that he had not read. His assistant, Rachel Bennett, sat across from him with a tablet in her hands, waiting, her posture straight, her tone professional. "You asked for a full audit summary of the Midtown locations," she said, breaking the silence carefully. Adrian did not answer right away, his eyes still fixed on the city below. "Something is off," he said finally, his voice low but certain. Rachel nodded slightly, already prepared. "We have had a few irregular reports, minor discrepancies in staff retention, inventory shrinkage, and tip distribution complaints. Nothing that triggered a full internal review yet." Adrian turned then, placing the report down on the desk without opening it. "It should have," he said simply, his tone calm, but carrying a quiet weight that made Rachel straighten just a little more. She tapped her tablet, bringing up more data. "If you want, I can schedule a formal investigation, notify regional management, and begin compliance checks." Adrian shook his head once. "No, not yet." He walked slowly toward the desk, resting his hands against the edge as he leaned forward slightly, thinking. The memory of Sophie placing that small paper basket in front of him replayed in his mind with surprising clarity. The hesitation, the decision, the absence of expectation. People reveal themselves in small moments, he said almost himself. Rachel watched him carefully, then asked, "Was something specific observed last night?" Adrian allowed the faintest pause before answering. "Yes, but not what you think." He straightened, picking up a different file this time, one that listed staffing details from that exact diner. "Sophie Miller," he read quietly, testing the name. Rachel quickly searched, pulling up her profile. Part-time server, no prior complaints, strong customer feedback, multiple shift pickups. Adrian took the tablet from her, scanning the limited information. There was nothing remarkable on paper, nothing that explained what he had seen, but that was exactly the point. Schedule me there again tonight, he said. Rachel blinked once, slightly surprised. You want to revisit personally? Adrian handed the tablet back. Yes, keep it off record. No alerts, no management involvement. I want to see how things operate when no one thinks they're being watched. Rachel hesitated for just a fraction of a second, then nodded, of course. I will arrange it discreetly. Adrian turned away, walking back toward the window, his reflection faint in the glass. And for the first time in a long time, his next move was not driven by numbers or strategy, but by curiosity, real, human curiosity. Later that same morning, across town, Sophie stood in a narrow bathroom mirror, tying her hair back into a loose ponytail, her reflection tired but determined. The small apartment behind her barely lit by a single window. She splashed cold water on her face, hoping it would shake off the exhaustion that clung to her shoulders. Last night had followed her into sleep, not in a dramatic way, but in small, quiet flashes, the look in his eyes, the way he had said next time. She shook her head lightly, pushing the thought aside. People passed through her life all the time, customers, strangers, moments that did not last. She could not afford to hold on to something that might mean nothing. She grabbed her bag, checking its contents, keys, phone, nothing else, and stepped out into the morning air. The city already louder now, buses rumbling, voices overlapping, life moving forward without pause. Back at the diner, the same routines waited for her, the same manager, the same tension beneath polite smiles. But something had shifted just slightly, like a thread had been pulled that could not be pushed back into place. And somewhere across the city, Adrian Cole was preparing to return, not as the man behind a glass office, but as the quiet stranger once. Again, because whatever he had started to uncover was no longer just about a business. It was about a person, and he intended to see it through. By the time evening settled over the city again, the diner was already alive with its usual rhythm. The hum of conversations blending with the sharp clatter of plates and the low hiss from the grill. Sophie moved quickly between tables, her steps light but efficient, her expression calm even as orders stacked faster than she could clear them. She had learned to keep her focus narrow, one table at a time, one task at a time. Anything to keep the weight of everything else from pressing in too hard. But every time the bell above the door chimed, something in her chest tightened just slightly. An expectation she refused to name. Then it happened. The door opened and the cool air slipped inside. And there he was again. The same quiet presence, the same steady eyes. Adrian stepped in without hesitation, dressed no differently than before, blending into the background of the room as if he belonged nowhere and everywhere at once. Sophie noticed him immediately, even before she wanted to. Her hand paused for just a fraction of a second as she set down a glass of water at another table. Then she turned away quickly, telling herself it meant nothing. He was just another customer, just another passing moment. But when she looked again, he was already seated in the same corner booth, as if the space had been waiting for him. A strange sense of familiarity settled in despite her efforts to ignore it. She approached slowly, not rushing this time, her voice steady but softer than before. You came back, she said, not quite a question. Adrian looked up, meeting her gaze with that same unreadable calm. I said there might be a next time, he replied, his tone even, almost careful. Sophie gave a small nod, pulling out her order pad. What can I get you tonight? Adrian glanced briefly at the menu, though it was clear he was not really reading it. Just a coffee, he said, then added after a pause, and maybe fries. Sophie could not help the faint curve of a smile that touched her lips before she could stop it. She wrote it down quickly, turning away before the moment could linger too long. In the kitchen, the tension was already building. The manager, Rick, stood near the pass-through window, his voice sharp as he called out orders. Faster! We are falling behind, he snapped, his eyes scanning the staff with impatience that never quite turned into accountability. Sophie grabbed the coffee and the basket of fries as soon as they were ready. Moving back to the corner booth, she placed them down carefully. Here you go, she said. Adrian watched her for a moment, then gestured lightly toward the fries. are you going to take? Half again. Sophie shook her head quickly, a hint of embarrassment flickering across her face. Not tonight, she replied, trying to keep her tone light. Adrian studied her reaction, noticing the subtle shift, the guarded edge that had not been there before. Instead of pressing, he simply nodded. Fair enough. They fell into a quiet rhythm after that, Sophie checking on him between tables, Adrian observing more than he spoke. The way the staff moved, the way Rick lingered too close to the register, the way a server quietly slipped a portion of her tips into an envelope that did not belong to her. Adrian said nothing, but each detail settled in a place in his mind, forming a pattern he could no longer ignore. At one point, a plate crashed near the kitchen entrance. A young waitress froze, her face pale as Rick turned on her instantly. Do you know how much that costs? He barked, his voice cutting through the room. Sophie stepped in before the moment could escalate. It was my fault, she said, quickly placing herself between them. I bumped into her. Rick narrowed his eyes, clearly unconvinced, but after a tense pause, he waved it off with irritation. Just clean it up and move. Sophie nodded, already kneeling to gather the broken pieces, her hands steady even. As the room slowly returned to its usual noise, Adrian watched the entire exchange without interruption, something tightening behind his calm expression. When Sophie returned to his table a few minutes later, her hands freshly washed but slightly red from the hot water, Adrian spoke again, his voice quieter now. You take responsibility for things that are not yours. Sophie shrugged lightly, avoiding his eyes as she adjusted the napkin holder. Someone has to, she said simply. Adrian leaned back, slightly, studying her with a deeper focus now. The pieces aligning, the small act from the night before, no longer an isolated moment, but part of something consistent, something real, outside. The sky had darkened completely, the glow of the diner standing out against the night, and inside, without either of them fully realizing it yet, the space between a quiet stranger and a struggling waitress was beginning to change into something neither of them could easily walk away from. The third night felt different before it even began, like the air itself had shifted in a way Sophie could not quite explain. The diner was just as loud, just as busy, but something beneath the surface had changed, a quiet tension that moved between glances and half-finished conversations. Sophie tied her apron a little tighter than usual, her fingers lingering at the knot as she steadied herself. She had told herself all day that none of this mattered, that the quiet man from the corner booth was just a passing moment. But when the bell above the door rang and she looked up, her breath caught before she could stop it. Adrian stepped inside again, but this time he did not head straight for the booth. Instead, he paused near the entrance, his eyes moving slowly across the room, taking in every detail, every movement, every small imbalance that others had learned to ignore. Sophie watched him for a second longer than she should have, then quickly turned back to her table, pretending to focus on refilling a glass that was already full. But she could feel it, the awareness of him in the room, like a thread pulling her attention no matter how hard she resisted it. Adrian eventually made his way to the booth, but he did not sit right away. Instead, he stood there for a moment, observing the kitchen pass, the register, the way. Rick leaned too casually against the counter while counting bills that did not seem to match the receipts. Adrian's expression remained calm, but his eyes sharpened with quiet certainty. The pattern was no longer a suspicion. It was a structure, and it was broken. Sophie approached him after a few minutes, her voice more composed now, like she had built a wall around whatever curiosity had tried to surface before, same as last time. She asked, keeping her tone neutral. Adrian looked at her, and, for the first time, there was something almost intentional in the way he answered. Actually, no, he said softly, surprising her. Sophie blinked, caught off guard. What do you mean? Adrian pulled out the chair and sat down slowly, then looked up at her with a calm that felt heavier than before. Sit for a second. Sophie hesitated immediately, glancing toward the kitchen where Rick was already watching the floor with a sharp eye. I cannot, she said quickly. I am working. Adrian nodded slightly, as if he expected that answer. Then he leaned back, lowering his voice just enough that only she could hear. Then answer me this. Why do you stay? Sophie frowned, the question landing harder than it should have. What do you mean? Adrian held her gaze steady and direct. You work hard, you cover for others, you take blame that is not yours. and you barely get enough to survive, so why stay? Sophie felt something tighten in her chest. Her first instinct was to deflect, to brush it off like everything else, but something about the way he asked made that impossible. She exhaled slowly. "Because I need the job," she said simply, "because there is nothing else waiting for me out there." Adrian watched her carefully, not judging, not interrupting, just listening. Sophie shifted slightly, lowering her voice, and because some people here need someone on their side, even if it does not change anything. Adrian let the silence stretch for a moment, then nodded once, as if confirming something. Only he understood. Before Sophie could ask what he meant, Rick's voice cut across the room again. "Sophie, you planning to stand there all night?" She straightened immediately, stepping back from the table. "I have to go," she said quickly. Adrian did not stop her this time. But as she turned away, he spoke one more time, his voice quiet but firm. "It can change." Sophie paused, just for a second, her back still turned. Then she shook her head slightly, almost to herself, and walked away, but the words stayed with her, settling somewhere she could not ignore across the room. Adrian remained seated, his attention no longer divided. The decision had already been made. This was no longer just an observation, it was intervention. And he would not wait much longer, because what he had seen was not just inefficiency or mismanagement. It was something deeper, something unfair. And for the first time since building his empire, the most important thing on his agenda was not profit. It was a single waitress who refused to stop being kind in a place that did not reward it. The next evening did not begin with calm. It began with pressure, the kind that settled into Sophie's shoulders before her shift even started. The diner was short-staffed, 2 servers had called out, and Rick was already in a mood that made the air feel tighter than usual. Sophie moved quickly from the moment she clocked in, tying her apron as she walked, grabbing a notepad, stepping straight into the rush without a pause. Orders came fast. Voices overlapped, and every mistake, no matter how small, seemed to land heavier than it should. Sophie kept her focus steady, but the word from the night before lingered in the back of her mind. It can change. She had tried to dismiss them, but they followed her through every step, every order, every forced smile. When the bell above the door rang again, she did not look up right away this time. She told herself she would not, but the awareness came anyway, like a quiet signal she could not ignore. Adrian entered once more, but something about him was different tonight. Not in the way he dressed, not in anything obvious, but in the way he moved, more deliberate, more present, as if he was no longer just observing. Sophie caught a glimpse of him as she passed by, and for a moment their eyes met. And this time she did not look away immediately. There was something unspoken there, something that made her chest tighten before she broke the moment and continued toward her table. Adrian took his usual seat, but he did not reach for the menu instead. He watched the room with a quiet intensity, noting the faster pace, the sharper tone in Rick's voice, the way staff moved with a mix of urgency and unease. Sophie approached him after a few minutes, her expression composed, but her eyes more tired than before. "You picked a busy night," she said, her voice carrying a hint of dry humor. Adrian nodded slightly. "I wanted to see that," he replied. Sophie frowned faintly at that. "What do you mean?" Adrian leaned forward just enough to lower his voice. "How things really work when no one is pretending." Sophie felt a flicker of unease at his words. Something about them felt too precise, too intentional. She tried to brush it off. "Well, you're seeing it," she said, reaching for a notepad. "What can I get you?" Adrian held her gaze for a second longer than usual, then answered the same, but this time he added, "And whatever you are having." Sophie blinked, caught off guard again. "I am not having anything," she said quickly. Adrian did not look convinced. "You did not have anything last night either," he said calmly. Sophie hesitated, then gave a small shrug. "It is not really your concern." Adrian did not push further, but there was a quiet firmness in his tone when he replied. "Maybe it should be." Sophie opened her mouth to respond, but Rick's voice cut through the moment again, sharper than before. "Sophie, table 6 has been waiting." She turned immediately, stepping away. "I have to go." Adrian watched her move across the room, faster now, carrying more weight than before. The pattern was no longer just about management or numbers. It was about people being stretched beyond what they should have to carry. A few minutes later, the tension escalated. A customer raised his voice at one of the newer servers. complaining about a delayed order. Rick stepped in, but instead of diffusing the situation, he redirected the frustration toward staff, making the young server shrink under the pressure. Sophie stepped in again, her voice calm but firm. "I will take care of it," she said, placing herself between them. Adrian observed closely, the consistency in her actions now undeniable. She absorbed pressure that was never hers, protected people who had no power to protect themselves, and did it without expecting anything in return. When Sophie returned to his table again, her movements slightly slower now, Adrian spoke before she could. "You should not have to do that." Sophie let out a quiet breath, setting down his coffee. "Maybe not," she said, "but if I do not, no one will." Adrian studied her, then asked, "What if someone did?" Sophie paused, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the table. "What if things actually changed? What if the way this place runs was not fixed? What if it could be better?" Sophie gave a small shake of her head, not dismissive, but realistic. "Places like this do not change," she said softly. "People just learn how to survive them." Adrian leaned back slightly, his decision settling fully into place. "Then maybe it is time someone stopped surviving and started fixing." Sophie met his eyes again, searching for something she could not quite name, but before she could respond, another call pulled her away, and the moment broke, but the words did not, because for the first time the idea that things could change did not feel completely impossible. And across the table, Adrian Cole was no longer asking questions, he was preparing to act. The shift did not slow down. If anything, it tightened, like a knot pulling harder with every passing minute. And Sophie felt it in the way her hands moved faster than her thoughts, in the way her breath came just a little shorter each time Rick's voice cut across the room. Something was building, not loud, not obvious, but steady like pressure behind a closed door. Adrian remained seated in the corner booth, but he was no longer just watching the surface. He was tracking patterns, movements, reactions, the way the register opened and closed more often than orders were completed, the way certain cash payments never seemed to match the receipts printed moments earlier, the way Rick positioned himself just out of direct sight whenever tips were counted. Adrian's gaze sharpened, not with anger, but with certainty. This was no longer a suspicion. It was a system designed to take advantage of the very people who kept the place running. Sophie moved past his table again, balancing two plates carefully, her wrists steady despite the weight, but Adrian noticed the small details others would miss, the slight stiffness in her shoulders, the faint redness on her hands from constant washing, the way she paused for half a second before approaching any table where Rick was standing, not out of fear exactly, but out of awareness, calculated, careful, adaptive. When she returned to him with a refill of coffee, he spoke again, his voice lower now, more direct. "How much do you actually take home at the end of a night like this?" Sophie blinked, surprised by the question, then gave a small, cautious smile. "Enough to get by," she said, deflecting as she always did. Adrian did not accept that answer. "Not fully. Enough is not a number," he replied calmly. Sophie hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly around the coffee pot handle. "It depends," she said after a moment, "on the tips, on the shifts, on whether anything goes wrong." Adrian leaned forward just enough to hold her attention. "And how often does it go wrong?" Sophie let out a quiet breath, glancing briefly toward the register where Rick stood counting bills again. "More often than it should," she admitted. Adrian followed her gaze, without turning his head, his voice steady. "Do you always see all of your tips?" Sophie did not answer right away, and that silence said more than anything else could have. She looked back at him, something conflicted behind her eyes. "You ask a lot of questions for someone who just came in for coffee," she said softly. Adrian held her gaze, unflinching. "Maybe I'm not here just for the coffee." Sophie felt a flicker of unease again, but also something else, curiosity mixed with caution. Before she could respond, a commotion broke out near the register. A customer arguing about a bill that did not match what he had ordered. Rick stepped in, his voice sharp and dismissive, insisting the system was correct, but Adrian could see the flaw immediately. The item had been entered twice, not by accident, but by habit. Sophie moved quickly to resolve it, her tone calm, her explanation careful. She corrected the bill without escalating the situation, apologizing for something she had not done. The customer left, still irritated, but quieter and Rick turned his attention toward Sophie. His expression tight. "You need to pay more attention," he said coldly. Sophie nodded, absorbing the blame without resistance. "I will double-check next time," she replied. Adrian watched the exchange, something firm settling behind his calm expression. When Sophie returned to his table again, he spoke before she could. "That was not your mistake." Sophie gave a small shrug, already moving to adjust the salt shaker on the table. "It does not matter whose mistake it was. It just matters that it gets fixed." Adrian studied her, then asked, "And who fixes it when it keeps happening?" Sophie paused, her hand resting still for a moment. Then she met his eyes again, quieter now. "No one." Adrian leaned back slowly, the final piece falling into place. The pattern was complete, the behavior consistent, the impact undeniable. This was not just poor management. It was exploitation, and it had gone unchecked for far too long. Sophie straightened, stepping back slightly. "I should get back," she said, her voice returning to its usual steady tone. Adrian nodded once, but his eyes did not leave her. Go ahead," he said, his voice calm, but carrying a quiet finality, because in that moment, the decision was no longer forming. It was made, and as Sophie walked away to continue her shift, unaware of what was about to change, Adrian Cole reached into his pocket slowly, not for money this time, but for something else entirely, something that would not stay hidden much longer. The tension that had been building finally found its direction, not in a loud explosion, but in a quiet shift that only one person in the room fully understood. Adrian Cole sat still for a moment longer after Sophie walked away, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table as his gaze moved once more across the diner. Nothing had changed on the surface. Orders still moved. Voices still overlapped. Rick still controlled the room with the same sharp authority, but for Adrian, everything had changed because now he was no longer observing. He was preparing to act. He reached into his jacket slowly and pulled out a simple card, turning it once between his fingers as if weighing the moment. Not yet, he thought. Not like this across the room. Sophie was already being pulled into another situation. A coworker whispered urgently to her near the kitchen entrance. Something about missing tips from the previous shift. Sophie listened, her brow tightening slightly. Then she glanced toward Rick again, the same hesitation flickering across her face, the same quiet calculation. Speak up or stay silent. Protect yourself or protect others. The choice was never simple. Adrian watched closely. This was the moment he needed to understand. Not the system, but her. Sophie took a slow breath, then shook her head gently, not in denial, but in restraint. "Just let it go for now," she said softly to her coworker. "We will figure it out later." The coworker looked frustrated but nodded, stepping away. Sophie stood there for a second longer, her shoulders heavy, then turned back into the rush as if nothing had happened. Adrian exhaled slowly. That was it. That was the line. She knew what was wrong. She saw it clearly, and still she chose to endure it rather than risk everything. Not because she was weak, but because she had too much to lose. Adrian stood up then, not abruptly, but with quiet purpose. He walked toward the counter, stopping just as Sophie turned back from delivering an order. She froze slightly when she saw him there again. Closer this time. His presence no longer distant. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice careful. Adrian held her gaze, his expression calm, but more direct than before. "No," he said simply. Sophie blinked, caught off guard by the honesty. "What do you mean?" Adrian lowered his voice, not enough for secrecy, but enough for focus. "I mean, things here are not okay, and you know that." Sophie felt the weight of his words immediately. Her instinct was to deflect again, to keep everything at the surface. "You are just a customer," she said quietly. "Try and draw a boundary. You do not need to worry about how this place runs." Adrian did not move, did not soften. "Maybe I do," he replied, his tone steady. Sophie searched his face, trying to understand what he meant. "Why do you care so much?" she asked, almost frustrated now. Adrian paused for the first time, not because he did not have an answer, but because the truth was bigger than what he could reveal in that moment, because people should not have to work like this. He said finally, his voice calm but firm. Sophie let out a small breath, shaking her head slightly. "That is just how it is," she said. "You get used to it." Adrian stepped a little closer, not invading her space, but closing the distance enough to make the moment real. What if he did not have to get used to it? Sophie looked at him, something unsettled rising again. You keep saying that, she said softly, like it is that easy. Adrian met her gaze fully now. It is not easy, he said, but it is possible. Sophie hesitated, caught between disbelief and something she could not quite name. Hope? Maybe, but hope was dangerous. Hope meant risk, and risk meant losing everything she had managed to hold together. Before she could respond, Rick's voice cut in again, sharper than ever. Sophie, I need you in the back. Now. Sophie stepped away immediately, the moment breaking again. I have to go, she said quickly. Adrian nodded once, but this time there was something final in his expression. Go, he said, his voice quieter now because he knew what came next would not be subtle. Sophie disappeared into the back, leaving Adrian standing at the counter, the noise of the diner continuing around him as if nothing had changed. But he knew better, because in that moment, the line between a quiet stranger and the man who owned everything in this room was about to disappear, and when it did, nothing here would stay the same. The moment Sophie stepped into the back room, the noise of the diner dulled into a distant hum, replaced by the sharper tension that lived behind closed doors. The air felt heavier here, thick with unspoken rules and quiet pressure. Rick stood near the supply shelf with his arms crossed, his expression already set before she even reached him. We need to talk, he said flatly. Sophie nodded once, steadying herself. What is going on? Rick did not answer right away. Instead, he reached into a drawer and pulled out a small stack of receipts, dropping them onto the metal counter between them. You tell me, he said, his tone edged with accusation. Sophie glanced down, recognizing the timestamp from earlier that night. Her brow furrowed. I handled those tables, she said carefully. Yes, you did, Rick replied, his voice tightening, and somehow the totals do not line up. Sophie felt a flicker of confusion, then realization. The same pattern she had seen before. The same quiet discrepancy that no one ever addressed openly. She looked back at him. Those are not wrong orders, she said, choosing her words carefully. They were entered twice. Rick's eyes narrowed. So now you are telling me the system is wrong. Sophie held her ground, her voice calm, but firmer now. I am saying something is off. Rick let out a short laugh, not amused. What is off is that I have a customer complaint and missing cash, and your name is attached to both. Sophie felt the weight of that settle in, heavier than anything before. This was different. This was not just blame in passing. This was deliberate. I did not take anything, she said quietly. Rick stepped closer, lowering his voice. You think I do not know how this works? Sophie, people get desperate. They make mistakes. They take shortcuts. Sophie shook her head, her chest tightening. I did not take anything. Rick straightened, his expression hard, then explained the numbers. Sophie opened her mouth, then closed it again, because the truth was not simple, because explaining it meant exposing something bigger, and that meant consequences she could not control. The silence stretched too long, and Rick took it as confirmation. I cannot have this on my floor, he said finally, his tone final. Sophie's breath caught. What are you saying? Rick did not hesitate. I am saying you are done for tonight, and do not come back until I decide what to do next. Sophie felt the ground shift under her, just like that. After everything, after every extra shift, every mistake she had covered, every moment she had stepped in for others, this was how it ended. You are suspending me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Rick shrugged. Slightly, call it what you want, but until I sort this out, you are off the schedule. Sophie stood still for a second, absorbing it, then nodded once, slow and controlled. Okay, she said quietly, because arguing would not change anything, because fighting here would only make it worse. She turned, grabbing her bag from the hook by the door, her hand steady even as her chest felt tight. When she stepped back into the diner, the noise returned all at once, but it felt distant now, disconnected, like she was no longer part of it. Adrian saw her immediately, the shift in her posture, the absence of her usual rhythm. She walked past his table without stopping, heading straight for the door. He stood up without thinking, following a few steps behind. Sophie, he called, his voice low but clear. She paused at the door, her hand resting on the handle, then turned slightly, her expression composed but guarded. I cannot talk right now, she said. Adrian stepped closer, his gaze steady. What happened? Sophie hesitated, then gave a small shake of her head. It does not matter, she said. It always matters, Adrian replied quietly. Sophie looked at him, something breaking through her control for just a moment. They think I took money, she said, her voice tight. Adrian's expression did Not change, but something colder settled behind it. Did you, he asked, not accusing, just direct. Sophie met his eyes, steady and unflinching. No. Adrian nodded once, as if that was all he needed. Then it is not over, he said. Sophie let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh. It is for me, she said. You do not understand. This is how it works. You get blamed, you get replaced, and no one asks questions. Adrian stepped closer, his voice lower now, but more certain than ever. I will ask questions. Sophie shook her head again, pulling the door open slightly. You cannot fix this, she said softly. Adrian met her gaze, and for the first time, there was no distance left in his voice. Watch me, he said, and as Sophie stepped out into the cold night, unsure whether to believe him or walk away for good, Adrian turned back toward the diner, no longer as a quiet stranger, but as the man who was about to make sure the truth could not be ignored. The bell above the diner door had barely settled from Sophie's exit when the atmosphere inside shifted in a way no one could quite explain. It was subtle at first, a pause in movement, a glance held a second too long, because Adrian Cole had not followed her out into the night. Instead, he turned back toward the center of the room, and for the first time since he walked in as a quiet stranger, he did not return to the corner booth. He walked straight toward the counter, his steps calm but deliberate. Rick barely looked up at first, still focused on the register, until Adrian stopped directly in front of him. We need to talk, Adrian said, his voice steady, not raised, but carrying enough weight to cut through the noise around them. Rick glanced up, irritation already forming. If you have a complaint, you can wait like everyone else. We are busy. Adrian did not move, did not react to the tone. This will not take long, he replied. Rick let out a short breath, clearly annoyed. Then make it quick. Adrian reached into his jacket slowly, pulling out the same card he had turned over in his hand earlier. He placed it flat on the counter between them, not dramatically, just enough for Rick to see it clearly. Rick's eyes dropped to the card, and for a brief second, confusion flickered across his face. Then recognition hit, hard and immediate. The color drained from his expression, the irritation gone, replaced by something much sharper, something closer to fear. The noise of the diner seemed to fade around them, as if the entire room had leaned in without realizing it. Rick straightened quickly, his voice changing in an instant. Sir, I did not realize you were visiting tonight. Adrian's expression remained unchanged. That is the point, he said. Calmly, Rick swallowed, glancing around as if searching for a way to regain control of the situation. If there is anything you need, we could discuss it in the office. Adrian shook his head slightly. No, we will discuss it here. His tone was still calm. But now there was no room for interpretation. Rick hesitated, then nodded stiffly, of course. Adrian rested one hand lightly on the counter, his gaze steady. I have been here for 3 nights, he said, his voice carrying just enough for the nearby staff to hear. I have watched how this place runs when no one thinks they are being observed. Rick forced a tight smile. Everything here is handled according to company standards. Adrian did not acknowledge the response. Instead, he continued. Orders entered twice, tips disappearing, staff covering mistakes are not theirs. His words were precise, measured, each one landing with quiet impact. Rick's composure began to crack at the edges. There must be some misunderstanding, he said quickly. Adrian met his eyes directly. There is no misunderstanding. The silence that followed was heavier than any raised voice could have been. A few staff members had stopped moving entirely, watching from a distance, unsure, but aware that something significant was happening. Adrian continued, his voice lower now, but sharper. Tonight, you accused one of your servers of taking money. Rick's jaw tightened. That situation is being handled. Adrian did not let him finish. No, it is not, he said, because she did not take anything. Rick hesitated, caught between denial and the reality in front of him. Adrian straightened slightly, his presence now impossible to ignore, effective immediately. You are no longer managing this location. Rick's breath caught, his voice faltering. Sir, I can explain. Adrian shook his head once, not interested in explanations that came too late. You already have, he replied. With your actions, Rick stood frozen, the authority he had relied on moments ago gone completely. Adrian turned slightly, addressing the room without raising his voice. Everyone, listen. The staff instinctively looked toward him, drawn by the calm certainty in his tone. There will be a full review of all records and tip distributions. No one here will be held responsible for decisions they did not make, and anyone affected will be compensated. The words settled over the room like a release, quiet but powerful. Adrian's gaze moved back to Rick one last time. You will wait in the office until someone from corporate arrives. Rick nodded slowly, unable to do anything else. As Adrian stepped away from the counter, the balance of the room had already shifted, the fear replaced by something else, something unfamiliar, relief. And as the door opened again to the cold night outside, Adrian did not hesitate this time. He stepped out into the darkness, knowing exactly where he was going, because the next conversation would not be about a business. It would be about the person who had walked away believing nothing could change, and he intended to prove her wrong. The cold air outside hit Sophie harder than she expected. Not because of the temperature, but because of everything that had just been taken from her in a single moment. She walked without direction at first, her steps quick, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if she could hold everything together just by staying in motion. The city lights blurred slightly as she blinked back the pressure building behind her eyes. She had been here before, not the same place, not the same night, but the same feeling. The ground shifting without warning, the effort never quite being enough. She slowed only when she reached the corner of the block, stopping beneath a dim streetlight, her breath uneven. Now, her thoughts louder than the traffic passing by. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was where things finally broke. She let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh. But there was no humor in it, just exhaustion. Behind her, the diner door opened again, but she did not turn. She did not expect anything to follow her out. Not really. Adrian stepped onto the sidewalk with purpose, his gaze finding her immediately under the pale glow of the streetlight. He walked toward her, not rushing but not hesitating either. Sophie heard his footsteps before she saw him, and when she turned, her expression shifted from guarded to something closer to disbelief. You should not be here, she said quietly. Adrian stopped a few feet away, his presence steady, neither too close nor distant. I told you it was not over, he replied. Sophie shook her head slightly, her voice tightening again. It is over for me. You saw what happened. I am done there. Adrian held her gaze, calm but certain. No, you are not. Sophie let out a breath, frustrated now. You do not get it, she said. People like me do not get second chances in places like that. We just get replaced. Adrian stepped a little closer, his voice lowering but strengthening. That is not what is happening tonight. Sophie frowned, confusion breaking through her frustration. What are you talking about? Adrian paused for a brief moment, not to hesitate, but to make sure she heard what came next clearly. I own that diner, he said, the words simple, direct, and impossible to misunderstand. Sophie stared at him, the world around her going strangely quiet. The traffic, the distant voices, everything faded behind the weight of what he had just said. That is not funny, she said after a second, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian did not smile, did not soften. I am not joking. Sophie searched his face, looking for any sign that this was not real. But all she found was the same steady calm that had been there from the beginning. The same quiet certainty that now made sense in a way it had not before. You are the owner, she repeated slowly. Adrian nodded once. Yes. Sophie took a small step back, her mind racing through every moment, every conversation, the fries, the questions, the way he had watched everything so closely. You knew, she said, her voice sharper now. You knew what was happening the whole time. Adrian did not deny it. I needed to see it for myself, he said. Sophie shook her head, a mix of emotions rising all at once. Disbelief, anger, confusion. So what she said, you came in, watched everything, let it happen, and now you just fix it. Just like that, Adrian met her frustration without reacting. I did not let it happen, he said calmly. I stopped it. Sophie looked away for a second, trying to process everything, then back at him. And what about me? She asked, her voice quieter now. What happens to me? Adrian stepped closer, his tone steady but softer than before. You were never the problem. Sophie let out a breath, her shoulders dropping slightly, but the doubt remained. That does not change anything, she said. I still got blamed. I still got sent home. Adrian shook his head once. That decision has already been reversed. Sophie froze. What do you mean? Adrian held her gaze. I removed the person who made that call, and there'll be a full review of everything that happened tonight, including your records. Sophie stared at him, the pieces slowly falling into place. You fired him, she said quietly. Adrian did not look away. Yes, Sophie exhaled slowly, the tension in her chest shifting into something unfamiliar. Not relief. Not yet. Something closer to disbelief. This cannot be real, she murmured. Adrian's voice softened just slightly. It is real. Sophie looked at him again, really looked this time. Not as a stranger, but as someone who had just changed everything she thought she understood about her own life. And for the first time, the words he had repeated over and over again began to feel less like empty promises and more like something possible, something dangerous, something that could actually change everything. The silence between them did not break quickly. It stretched, heavy and uncertain, as Sophie stood under the dim streetlight, trying to understand how a single moment could shift everything she thought she knew. Her mind moved through every detail again. The quiet man in the corner booth, the questions, the way he had watched without interfering. And now this. The truth standing in front of her, calm and undeniable. She let out a slow breath. Her voice softer. Now, but still unsteady. Why did you not say anything? Adrian did not answer immediately, not because he did not have one, but because the answer mattered, because the truth behind it was not simple. I needed to see who you were when nothing was on the line, he said finally. His tone even. Sophie frowned slightly, processing that. And what? She asked. Did you find? Adrian held her gaze, not looking away. Someone who gives when she has nothing. Someone who protects people who cannot protect themselves. Someone who does not change, even when the situation does. Sophie felt something shift inside her again. Not discomfort this time, but something quieter, something she was not used to hearing about herself. You make it sound like that matters, she said, almost defensive. Adrian stepped a little closer, his voice steady. It does. Sophie shook her head slightly, her arms still crossed. No, it does not. Not in places like that. Not in real life. Adrian did not argue, but he did not agree either. Then maybe it should, he said, and that simple statement landed harder than anything else had. Sophie looked away for a moment, her eyes tracing the sidewalk, the cracks in the pavement, anything to ground herself, because if she looked at him too long, she might start believing something she had spent years learning not to believe. After a few seconds, she spoke again, quieter now. So what happens now? Adrian reached into his jacket once more, but this time what he pulled out was not a business card. It was a small folded paper bag, slightly worn at the edges. He held it out to her. Sophie looked at it, confused, then took it slowly, opening it just enough to see what was inside. A few fries, cold now, but unmistakable. Her breath caught. You kept them, she said softly. Adrian nodded once. He said not to let them get cold. He replied, and even though they had, the meaning behind them had not changed. Sophie stared at the small bag in her hands, something tightening in her chest again. But this time was not fear, it was something else, something warmer, something she did not know how to handle. Why? She asked quietly. Adrian answered without hesitation. Because that moment mattered. Sophie looked up at him again, really looking this time, seeing not just the man who owned the diner, but the man who had noticed something no one else ever had, who had taken a small act and treated it like it meant something real. I do not need charity, she said after a moment, her voice steadier now. Adrian shook his head immediately. This is not charity, he said. This is recognition. Sophie hesitated, then closed the small bag carefully, holding it a little tighter than she intended. Adrian continued, his tone calm, but certain. I want you to come back. Tomorrow. Not as someone trying to hold everything together, but as someone who has a say in how things are run. Sophie blinked, surprised. What do you mean? Adrian met her gaze. I mean, I want you to help rebuild that place. Properly this time. Sophie let out a quiet breath, overwhelmed again. I am just a server, she said. Adrian gave a small shake of his head. No. You are someone who understands what that place needs better than anyone I've seen. Sophie looked down at the bag in her hands. Again, the small, simple reminder of a moment she had almost forgotten, and for the first time, the idea that her choices, her small acts, could actually lead somewhere did not feel impossible. It felt real, uncertain, but real. She looked back up at him, her voice quieter now, but clearer. And if I say no, Adrian did not hesitate. Then I will still fix what is broken, he said, but I think it would mean more if you were part of it. Sophie stood there for a moment longer, the city moving around. The night carrying on like nothing had changed. But everything had, because for the first time, she was not just being asked to survive a situation, she was being asked to shape it. And that was something she had never been offered before. The next morning did not feel like any other morning Sophie had lived before. The city was the same. The streets carried the same noise, the same movement, but something inside her had shifted in a way she could not ignore. She stood outside the diner for a long moment before stepping inside. The familiar bell above the door chimed softly, but the atmosphere inside was no longer the same. The sharp tension that once filled the space had been replaced by something quieter, something uncertain but lighter. Staff moved differently, not rushed in fear, but cautiously hopeful. Conversations were softer, glances less guarded. Sophie stepped in slowly, her eyes scanning the room, trying to understand what had changed and what had stayed the same. Adrian stood near the counter. Not hidden this time, not observing from the corner, but present, visible. Part of the space he owned. When he saw her, he gave a small nod. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just steady like he had been expecting her. Sophie walked toward him, her steps careful but sure. "I almost did not come," she admitted quietly. Adrian's expression softened just slightly. "But you did," he replied. Sophie glanced around the diner again. "What happened?" she asked. Adrian gestured lightly toward the room. "Everything that should have happened a long time ago," he said. "There will be a full audit. Every employee will receive what they were owed, and the structure here is being rebuilt from the ground up." Sophie took that in slowly, her chest tightening again, but not from fear this time, from the weight of something real finally taking shape. "And me?" she asked. Adrian met her gaze, steady and certain. "You are here because I meant what I said." Sophie hesitated, the old doubt rising for just a moment. "I do not know how to run a place like this," she said. Adrian shook his head. "You know how to treat people," he replied. "The rest can be learned." Sophie looked down at her hands, then back at him, the small paper bag still in her grasp from the night before. She had not thrown it away. She had not even opened it again. She had just kept it, as if it held something more than what it was. "I am not like you," she said quietly. Adrian's answer came without hesitation. "That is exactly why this will work." Sophie let out a slow breath, the last of her hesitation beginning to loosen. Then she nodded once, not a dramatic decision, but a real one. "Okay," she said. Adrian gave a slight nod in return, as if that was all that was needed. The rest of the morning unfolded differently than anything Sophie had experienced before. Instead of rushing between tables, she stood beside Adrian as he spoke with staff. Not above them, not distant, but direct and clear. He explained the changes, listened to concerns, made it clear that what had been tolerated before would not continue. And for the first time, Sophie saw what leadership looked like when it was not built on control, but on accountability. Days turned into weeks, and the diner slowly transformed, not just in how it operated, but in how it felt. The staff stayed, new people joined. The fear that once defined the space faded into something steadier, something healthier. Sophie found her place in it, not as someone struggling to survive each shift, but as someone shaping how those shifts worked. She learned quickly, adapted faster than she expected, and with every decision, every small improvement, she saw the impact of what Adrian had trusted her to do. One evening, long after the dinner rush had ended and the last customer had left, Sophie stood behind the counter, looking at the quiet room. The lights softer now, the noise replaced by calm. Adrian stepped beside her, his presence as steady as it had always been. "It looks different," she said. Adrian nodded. "It is different." Sophie glanced at him, then reached in her apron pocket, pulling out the small paper bag. She opened it this time, the fries inside long cold, but still there. She smiled faintly. "You kept them," she said. Adrian looked at the bag, then back at her. "You shared them," he replied. Sophie held his gaze for a moment longer, something unspoken passing between them. Then she said quietly, "I think that was the moment everything changed." Adrian's voice softened. "Not just for the business." Sophie nodded, understanding what he meant. And for the first time, she did not feel like someone passing through a place. She felt like someone who belonged, not because of what she had, but because of who she had always been. And as the lights dimmed and the night settled around them, the small act that had started with a simple choice had grown into something far greater. Not just a new beginning, but a proof that kindness, when seen and valued, could change more than a single moment. It could change everything.